Good morning, and thank you for joining us. It was a cold January morning, or it was a crisp, bright January morning, depending on who you talk to. There was a young couple just married for a couple of weeks, starting out a new life together. They're getting ready to move 2,000 miles away to start their life in a new location, a new place. But first, they say goodbye to their family and friends and leave them standing on the sidewalk as they drive away in their small compact car. As they drive down the road, everything's great. Everything is wonderful, exciting, new, something different. What could possibly go wrong? There's an old TV show that was called Newlyweds Game. The Newlyweds Game, Bob, the host of the show, would ask simple questions of these new couples who had just been married and ask them questions about their husband or wife and see what kind of answers they would come up with. They often came up with conflicting answers, something different. It was kind of interesting to watch because as they started out, they would introduce the couples and they were always friendly and loving and kind to one another and close, affectionate. But as the questions went on and as they began to have conflicts and they began to argue about different things, the quarreling started. And when it did, sometimes those marriages looked like they may not make it to the end of the show. But, of course, they always did. But in these questions and answers, you've recognized the fact that there were disputes that would rise and come up. Well, our young couple was no different. As they got 2 hours down the road and started to realize that there was something wrong, the husband asked his wife, "What's wrong?" And she says, "I miss my mom. I feel badly leaving, and I feel like I shouldn't have left." Well, this kind of raised some questions with the husband, and so he started to ask different questions, feeling like I should be enough. I should be able to fill that hole. Why would you need anyone else? And that, of course, escalated and became a problem in and of itself. So the couple ended up opposite sides of a small compact car as you can get, plastered against the window, and looking out the window, she finally broke down and cried. Well, we'll get back to our couple in a little bit. But I want to ask you a question. How many times have we fallen into the trap of quarreling whenever we have disagreements, when we maybe have a different opinion on something that really doesn't even matter, maybe even things that we don't care about at all, but yet we can fight and fuss and argue about it? I believe it's Satan that causes this, that he is able and does cause us to fall into a trap. The evidence that I'm going to quote from comes from 2 Timothy chapter 2. If you look at the last verse of that chapter, this is what it says. In verse 26, that they will come to their senses and escape from the trap of the devil, who has taken them captive to do his will. Satan sets traps, and he uses different baits. Throughout history, he has used a number of them over and over again. He uses lust, anger, he uses bitterness, he uses greed and envy and pride. All of these are different baits that he uses to set in his trap. He also uses different disguises for his traps, different kinds of traps, to trap people into doing what he wants. But I want you to notice what it ends with. It says, he has taken them captive to do his will. Do you want to be in his service? Do you want to do his will? There was a man named Stalin, who was quoted as saying of those who helped and worked alongside of his communist government, those that didn't believe and agree with him, but helped the situation, he called them useful idiots. I feel like sometimes that I'm a useful idiot when it comes to Satan because he's trapped me. He's snagged me and made me his servant. I don't want to be. I don't think any of us want to be, but we end up being his servants. How does it happen? And how do we avoid it? That's what I'd like to look at today. Let's back up and look at 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 14. Keep reminding them of these things. Warn them before God against quarreling about words. It is of no value and only ruins those who listens. Identifying the trap is an important part of avoiding it. When I was about 10 years old, I had about 20 acres that I roamed and played on, and we had a stack of pipe, old concrete pipe at the back of the property, actually on the neighbor's property. But I noticed that there was a little ferret that had taken up residence there, and it may have been a weasel, I'm not sure. But I wanted to catch that little animal, so I set up a trap, and I baited it, and I disguised the trap just like I should. But instead of catching the weasel, I caught the neighbor's dog. You see, it's important to know how to trap and what to trap and how to bait it. Satan has all of that information. And the greatest tool in his case, I believe, is quarrels. Quarrels and arguments based on words. In Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 18, he says, a hot-tempered person stirs up conflict, but the one who is patient calms a quarrel. In Proverbs 20 and verse 3, it says, it is to one's honor to avoid strife, but every fool is quick to quarrel. And my personal favorite, Proverbs 17 and verse 14, starting a quarrel is like breaching a dam, so drop the matter before the dispute breaks out. You can't put it back once you start. Once an argument is opened up, you've already begun. It's hard to plug that back up and to keep that dam from breaking loose and just completely washing out. Satan knows this, and he knows how to use it to his advantage. He begins an argument with something very unimportant. How many times have you argued with someone and you debate with them and you become angry and frustrated and you go your separate ways, and later you ask yourself, what was that about? Where did it start? What was the problem to begin with? And we can't even remember why we started the fight. That's the way Satan works. He likes to trap us. He uses these words, these quarrels, to begin and end an argument. But in verse 15 it says, do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a workman who does not need to be ashamed, and who correctly handles the word of truth. We need to be careful of the words we use. In James chapter 3, he talks about taming the tongue. He talks about how a tongue is like a spark. It could begin a wildfire. He also talks about a ship and how a small rudder steers that large ship. Our tongue, if we control it, can accomplish great things. He even uses a horse and the bridle as a description of how you can control your actions, the things that happen in your life, by controlling your tongue. Keep it bridled. But it's easier said than done. Here he is in 2 Timothy chapter 2. He's challenging them to watch their words, to be careful. In verse 16, he says, avoid godless chatter, because those who indulge in it will become more and more ungodly. It just dominoes. It gets out of control. The more we use words to harm, damage, win a battle, whatever it might be, the worse things get, the more ungodly you get. And before long, it's out of control. But he talks about something else here. He says, their teachings will spread like gangrene. Among them are Hymenaeus and Philetus, who have wandered away from the truth. They say that the resurrection has already taken place, and they destroy the faith of some. Nevertheless, God's solid foundation stands firm, sealed with this inscription: The Lord knows those who are his. And everyone who confesses the name of the Lord must turn away from wickedness. You know, there's a lot of people that cause disputes and anger and frustration and lead people astray. They confuse people. In this instance, this couple of people who are causing problems by saying that Jesus has already come back again, that he has returned and taken those with him. But we know that's not true, because that doesn't fit the description of what Jesus said that he would do and how he would come back in the clouds, that everyone would see him. So we know that that isn't true, and many then probably knew that as well. But the damage that was done to those whose faith was weak or maybe young were led astray and lost because of the words of these who are arguing and quarreling about these things. But Paul wants to drive the point home, so he uses an illustration. He says in verse 20, "In a large house there are articles, not only of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay. Some are for noble purposes, and some for ignoble purposes. If a man cleanses himself from the latter, he will be an instrument of noble purposes, made holy, useful to the master, and prepared to do any good work." We could get caught up in becoming just a typical average household item to be used and discarded. Or we could choose to be a priceless gold, silver ornament that is used and kept and respected. But it's up to us. Do we want to be useful to the master? Do we want to be different, something more than just disposable? In verse 22, he says, "Flee the evil desires of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart." If we don't want to be used by Satan, if we want to be available for God to use as he chooses, then we have to choose who we're going to serve. We can serve Satan even though we don't agree with him or follow his will or want to follow his will. But when we choose to argue, when we choose to use our words against each other to stir up problems, quarrels, then we are being useful idiots for Satan. We're allowing him to be the one in control. And here he uses this idea of righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with having a pure heart for the Lord, as the way that we can avoid being Satan's servants, falling into his will and doing what he wants. But it doesn't end there. In verse 23, he says, "Don't have anything to do with foolish or stupid arguments, because you know they produce quarrels." In Romans chapter 14 and verse 1, Paul says, "Accept the one whose faith is weak, without quarreling over disputable matters." There's a lot of things that we argue and quarrel about that are unimportant, that are gray items, not black and white, but we think our way is the best, so we try to convince others that this is the right way. In doing that, we cause strife, we cause problems. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 3, it says, "You are still worldly, for since there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere humans?" Paul recognized the fact that if we are serving Satan, we cannot be serving God, even though we're not really for Satan. We fall into his trap and we become his servants. If we want to be servants for God, then we cannot be servants for Satan. In verse 25, he says, "Those who oppose him, he must gently instruct, in the hope that God will grant them repentance, leading them to knowledge of the truth." We're going to run into times when There are black and white answers. There is right and wrong. And we need to stand for God's truths. But when we do, we need to be careful of how we do that. Not with anger or resentment or pride or jealousy or whatever bait that God or that Satan has set in our trap, but rather with love, patience, kindness, goodness, self-control. We need to use these things as our bait, our tools to helping us in allowing God to work through us and reaching those, defending his truths, but not through arguments or quarreling. Instead, through love and caring. The young couple that we started out talking about. Well, the end of the story is we've been married for 36 years and we've learned a lot of lessons over the years. It's easy to fall into the trap of quarreling, arguing, fussing, but it's also something that causes great pain and anguish and sometimes separation. Through the years, we've learned a few things and we've maybe be able to pass on some of those things to others, just like Proverbs does. But one of the things that what I feel like is probably the greatest lesson that we've learned is how to care for one another's heart. Sometimes we don't make sense. Sometimes our arguments are not logical. Sometimes we just have feelings, maybe hurts, maybe pains, maybe emotional damage in our lives. And dealing with that is not always logical. But when we care for one another's hearts, when we care for each other enough to stop and say, why are you feeling the way you are? What is it that I can do for you? How can I help you along the way? There's a difference that comes over that person. Instead of feeling defensive, feeling vulnerable, feeling hurt by others' words, instead, they feel loved. They feel cared for. They feel like this is a team. We're working together. Instead of feeling like we're debating, we're working against, we're quarreling with one another. I believe Paul's instructions here in 2 Timothy chapter 2 is simply this. Instead of falling into Satan's trap, instead of allowing him to control our narrative, to be the one to use us as useful idiots, instead, we should allow God to use us as more noble fixtures, to be able to use us in ways to help, to encourage, to lift one another up. It's easy in today's world, as it has been throughout many generations, to use our words to hurt, to cripple, to destroy. But that's not God's way. That's not what he wants for us. In these verses that we've just read, he shares about what we should do and how we can do something better, something more for him. He ends again with a verse that we started with in verse 26, that they will come to their senses and escape from the trap of the devil, who has taken them captive to do his will. There is escaping from the trap that Satan has set. There is repairs that are able to be done to the heart, even when we've done damage. Don't allow them to fester, to become worse, to domino out of control. Instead, correct the mistakes that we've made. Admit the wrongs and simply apologize for the words that we've used in anger or frustration. Repair the damage and start over again. There's many ways that we can do these damaging things and use these damaging words, but that's not God's desire. When we do these things, we fall into Satan's plan and his trap, and we become his servants. So who do you want to serve today? Do you want to serve God or do you want to serve Satan? If you want to serve God, maybe spend some time here in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and learn of his suggestions. Spend some time learning from the Proverbs and how we can understand and know better the will of God and how we can combat the traps that Satan has set for us. I hope that you will have a wonderful week, and I pray that you will consider these things and put them into work. May you all be blessed. Thank you for joining us.